Thank you for joining today's call with Integrity First for America, hosted by the Jewish Democratic Council of America. My name is Haley Soifer, and I'm the Executive Director of JDCA. In the nearly 3 years since our founding, JDCA has established itself as the national voice of Jewish Democrats advocating for Jewish and democratic values. Several weeks ago, amid the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, JDCA launched the Democrats Leading in Crisis call series, amplifying the voices of those leading amid crisis. Each week, we have brought together members of Congress, experts, and hundreds of you. Like so many of you, we are shaken by the events last week in Minneapolis and around the country that have continued to this day. Our Jewish values call on us to support equality, justice, and righteousness, and we believe that an injustice to any community or any individual is an injustice to all. The murder of George Floyd was unconscionable, heartbreaking, and indicative of the ongoing rise of racism and hatred in America in recent years. We cannot be silent as innocent Americans, such as George Floyd, are targeted because of their race and killed. The Jewish Democratic Council of America stands with the Black community and those peacefully protesting this violence across the country at this time of anguish, and we are committed to combating hatred together. Both the Jewish and Black communities have been targeted by rising hatred and division in our country. Racism and anti-Semitism and hatred in all of its forms are bred from a similar dangerous ideology, and we stand together against bigotry. Today's speakers are from the nonprofit organization Integrity First for America, and they have been on the front lines of fighting against bigotry, anti-Semitism, and white supremacy since filing a lawsuit against the hate groups who organized the 2017 Unite the Right March in Charlottesville. Unsurprisingly, some of the defendants in their case have recently surfaced, exacerbating tensions that we've seen in state capitals, protesting social distancing, and even more recently, in recent days, stoking racial tension, inciting violence, and spreading disinformation. Our speakers will take your questions after their remarks, so please send them to info@jewishdems.org, or you can post them in the chat of this Zoom. Now I will turn it over to JDCA's board member, Dan Berger in Philadelphia, to introduce our two speakers. Over to you, Dan. I think Dan is still muted. Okay, I don't know if Dan can hear us to tell him to unmute, so I will introduce our two speakers. Integrity First for America is a non-partisan nonprofit dedicated to protecting the integrity of our democracy. Oh, great. Here we have Dan.
I'm back.
Take it away.
All right. Hang on one second. Haley, as I said, can you hear me okay? Can you hear me?
We hear you, Dan. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Haley. And I apologize for technical difficulties. We're in the digital age, and it's an imperfect one at that. In any event, I'm excited to welcome two incredible speakers from Integrity First for America to discuss their work suing Nazis and combating white nationalism. We had a representative of the group on too, as a matter of fact, several weeks ago. At that time, I expressed my great admiration for their work. I'm also a lawyer. This really is litigation in the public interest, and it's also a profile in courage, what they are doing. And their work in court and in litigation goes beyond the litigation itself in Charlottesville and has direct relevance to the events going on today. Integrity First for America is a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to protecting the integrity of our democracy by fighting back against efforts to dismantle the norms that have kept America strong. Most notably, IFA is the organization supporting Signs versus Kessler, the lawsuit filed by a coalition of Charlottesville community members against the Nazis and white supremacists responsible for the violence there. The trial for this case is currently scheduled for October 2020. Amy Spitalnik is Executive Director of Integrity First for America. Amy previously served as Communications Director and Senior Policy Advisor to the New York Attorney General, Communications Advisor and Spokesperson for the New York City Mayor, and Communications Director in the New York State Senate. We're also excited to welcome Michael Block. Michael Block is counsel at Kaplan, Heckler, and Fink, currently counsel for plaintiffs in the ongoing litigation. Michael is currently partnering with Integrity First for America to sue the 24 neo-Nazi, white supremacists, and hate groups responsible for the violence that took place in Charlottesville in August 2017. Previously, Michael was a supervisor in the Bronx Defenders Criminal Defense Practice, a member of the Homicide Practice Group, and previously served as a supervisor of the Investigations Practice. Thank you, Amy and Michael, for joining us today and for your services fighting hatred. As a reminder, please send your questions to info@jewishdems.org, and our Executive Director, Haley Soifer, will get them. Over to you, Amy and Michael.
Thanks so much, Dan and Haley. It's a pleasure to be here today, to be joined by Mike, who is one of the lead attorneys in our Charlottesville suit. And he has certainly been keeping things busy over the last couple of weeks. So I'm glad that Mike was able to take some time to be with us today as well. I think it's, obviously the issues at hand that this call was scheduled before we knew what the last week would look like, but it's impossible to look at our Charlottesville case and look at the issues we're tackling in that case without understanding the context of the last few days. And we know that the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, and Tony McDade, and so many others are the tragic and unsurprising results of the same racist and broken system that also fueled Charlottesville and Charleston and the litany of other white supremacist attacks that we've seen in recent years. And while, as a white Jewish person, I feel like there is not much I could say right now that truly does justice to the horror of this movement, I do feel that at IFA we have an opportunity to actually do something about it, which is to continue to commit to dismantle the systems of white supremacy and racism that continue to rear their ugly head in this country. And we are so proud to be doing so through this lawsuit in partnership with Mike and our legal team and our incredibly brave plaintiffs. So thank you so much for being here and for taking the time to learn about this. I'll sort of give a quick overview of IFA and how this came about, pass it to Mike to share the details of the case, our legal theory, and where things stand. And there certainly has been no shortage of developments over the last few weeks in this case, all of them positive, I would say. And then give you some context about how this case fits into the broader fight against white supremacy and racism. And then really looking forward to hearing from you with questions, particularly given the intersection of this work with so much else that is happening in this country related to both coronavirus and the Floyd protests. So Integrity First for America is all in on the Charlottesville case. It means that everything we are doing right now is in direct support of our plaintiffs and of our legal team and ensuring that they can be successful when we go to trial this October. It's easy to forget, and perhaps now it's a little less easy to forget these days, but 2.5 years ago, almost 3 years ago in an American city, neo-Nazis attacked groups of peaceful counter-protesters and descended on a city with the goal of bringing violence. First, many of you might recall the infamous Tiki torch march, where these neo-Nazis and white supremacists descended on the University of Virginia, chanting things like "Jews will not replace us" and "blood and soil." And they surrounded a group of peaceful counter-protesters at the Thomas Jefferson statue. They threw torches and fuel and kicked and beat up these protesters. They had to shelter in place at a nearby interfaith service. Of course, the next day was no different. These neo-Nazis and white supremacists now descended on downtown Charlottesville under the guise of protesting the removal of a Confederate statue, but that's not what they were there to do. They were there to wreak havoc and bring violence to Charlottesville. Among other things, they surrounded the local synagogue, which was observing Shabbat services. People had to be evacuated out the back door, including Torah scrolls as well. The detail that sticks with me most every time I read our lawsuit and every time I talk about this is how a Torah scroll that had been saved from Nazi Germany decades ago was once again under Nazi threat in America in 2017. And that just gets me every single time, and I think is really indicative of the horror of what happened there. Of course, the violence continued throughout the day, with protesters attacking, with these rather neo-Nazis and white supremacists attacking peaceful counter-protesters, including interfaith clergy, like our plaintiff, Reverend Seth Whistleway, African Americans, Jews, and others, targeting them based on their race, their religion, and their willingness to stand up for others. And as we all know, the day culminated in a car attack in which a neo-Nazi drove his car into a crowd of peaceful counter-protesters, killing Heather Heyer and injuring countless others, including many of our plaintiffs whom you can see in that iconic Pulitzer photo of the car going through the crowd, including Marcus Martin, Marissa Blair. You see Marcus sprawled over the back of the car, the African-American man in a white tank top, pushing his then fiancée, now wife Marissa, out of the way, and countless others who were injured. And so on behalf of these 10 plaintiffs who were injured in the violence throughout the weekend, IFA is backing this lawsuit, working with an incredible legal team led by Mike and others, to take these neo-Nazis and white supremacists to court and hold them accountable for their actions. What's really important to understand here is that nothing that happened in Charlottesville was an accident. It was all part of a plan to bring violence to Charlottesville, planned for months in advance on social media and other platforms. And so with that, I'm going to pass it to Mike to dive into the details of the case, of those chats in which the violence was planned, and the legal theory that we are using in this case.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks for your ongoing support of the litigation. And thank you, Haley and Dan, for having us. It's really heartwarming to know that there's so many people that are interested in supporting us. So as Amy mentioned correctly, everything that happened in Charlottesville was no accident. It was meticulously planned. It was carefully orchestrated, beginning, as Amy mentioned, with the torchlit march on Friday night through UVA, which is, it's hard to stress enough how terrifying that really was to the community members and to the UVA community. They marched through UVA campus chanting Nazi slogans with tiki torches, and there were literally students and faculty and members of the community who were literally gathering up their items that identified them as Jewish, for example, and stowing them and literally running out the back door because they thought that this horde of hundreds of Nazis was coming to burn down the campus. They didn't, fortunately, but what they did do is they surrounded a group of students, primarily at the Thomas Jefferson statue in UVA. They clearly, carefully pinned them in and then attacked them. You will see, particularly if you read our complaint, which is online at integrityfirstforamerica.org, you will see that after Friday night, the defendants reacted as if it was a complete success. It was exactly what they had hoped would happen. And then going into Saturday, when a slew of violence occurred on the streets of Charlottesville, culminating in the car attack by James Fields. So, but the thrust of the suit is all of this was planned. So how do we know that? Most of it was planned online on a social media platform called Discord, which is primarily a gaming platform, but it provides for private invite-only servers. So the defendants set up a number of these servers, the primary one called Charlottesville 2.0, and they, for months, planned literally every aspect of what happened on August 11th and 12th. They talked about how to make weapons that can appear to be First Amendment tools, but can be used to bludgeon people. They had lawyers in place. They had medics in place. They talked about fighting tactics. Some of them wore black because black hides blood better. And they talked about things as specific as whether it's legal in Virginia to run over counter protesters. So there was nothing that happened on the weekend 11th and 12th was certainly a surprise to the defendants. In fact, to the contrary, it was everything that they planned. So we represent folks that were injured, citizens of Virginia that were injured Friday night and Saturday night in various aspects of the rally. And we sued under a statute called the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, which was originally designed for basically precisely this. It was to give victims of a conspiracy to commit racially motivated violence a private right of action against the perpetrators. And that is precisely what we have in this case. It was an agreement. Conspiracy is basically just a fancy legal word for an agreement to do something illegal. And that's what they did. And so we've sued basically all of the main organizers of the rally under the Ku Klux Klan Act, under the theory that they conspired to commit racially motivated violence. We brought suit in October of 2017. We served our first discovery requests for emails and cell phones and social media accounts in January of 2018. And we have since that day been fighting tooth and nail really to get from the defendants any evidence, additional evidence, in addition to what we've recovered off Discord, additional evidence from their cell phones and social media accounts and email accounts, which has been a real battle, primarily because, as you might imagine, Nazis don't generally participate willingly in federal litigation. And so we have seen a host of social media accounts deleted, cell phones have been destroyed or disappeared. It was sort of this cascade of disappearing evidence once we served our discovery requests in January of 2018. So we have litigated since then, trying to either recover what remains that was not destroyed, or to get sanctions against those defendants that have committed discovery misconduct that resulted in the permanent destruction of evidence. And by and large, we've been extraordinarily successful. I believe we've won every single discovery motion that we have brought. We have been able to recover a great deal of what remains. And we have also been able to get sanctions so far. There are a number of sanctions motions that are still pending, but we have been able to get sanctions against a number of defendants, including one defendant was actually held in contempt of court and incarcerated for a period of time for not complying in this case. And just last week, we won a number of motions to compel and sanctions motions against 4 different defendants who have not been in compliance. And we still have a number of motions for sanctions pending while we are proceeding into the deposition phase of discovery. And as Amy mentioned, we are set for trial in October.
Thanks. And so I think Mike is being a little humble in some ways, in that the motions that we won last week, I think, are fairly extraordinary, particularly for a piece of civil litigation like this, and the lawyers like Dan on the call can probably agree. Mike and our legal team won over $41,000 in sanctions against 3 key neo-Nazi defendants, 2 individuals and 1 group, who are at the center of planning the violence in Charlottesville. And I think that also underscores why we believe this case is so important. Certainly this case is so important because our plaintiffs deserve justice for what happened to them, and those responsible for the violence in Charlottesville must be held accountable. Thus far, there has been very little accountability for what happened in Charlottesville. There's been a handful of individual prosecutions, but the broad leadership responsible for conspiring to bring this violence there has not faced accountability, and this suit seeks to do that. But the suit is also so important because it really is the only broad legal effort to go after the leadership of this movement, take them on, bankrupt them, and dismantle them. And that's what not just these sanctions that we've been winning over the last few months can do, but when we go to trial this October and win massive civil judgments against them, that will really ensure that we'll be able to effectively bankrupt them and dismantle their ability to operate. And that's particularly important because we see over and over again how these defendants are at the center of the much larger white supremacist movement. I suspect you know many of the names, people like Richard Spencer, Andrew England, Chris Cantwell, Identity Europa, Matthew Heimbach. The list goes on and on. You can read it on our website, including in the lawsuit itself, if you choose. And you probably know some of these names because they are directly related to so many other incidences of white supremacist violence in recent years. We know, for example, that the Pittsburgh shooter who killed 11 people praying in synagogue at Tree of Life congregation communicated on Gab, which is a right-wing hate site, with some of the Charlottesville leaders before his attack. We know that the Christchurch shooter who killed dozens of Muslims praying in mosque about a year ago painted onto his gun a symbol known as the hashtag, first popularized by one of our defendants, Matthew Heimbach. And then in turn, Christchurch inspired the Poway attack, the El Paso attack, and on and on. We see so often how these defendants are at the center of this cycle of white supremacist violence. And during both coronavirus and now these protests, we are seeing our defendants play a central role yet again in trying to stir hate and disinformation and violence, as Haley mentioned earlier. First, during coronavirus, there's been a wave of attempted white supremacist attacks in addition to conspiracy theories and other disinformation promoted by our defendants and their supporters. Among other things, that includes an attempted bombing of a hospital in Missouri that was treating coronavirus patients. And many of you might have seen this now infamous viral sign of a neo-Nazi at a Columbus anti-public health protest that says Jews are, quote, the real plague, with a rat and a Star of David and a yarmulke. And as it turns out, both of those individuals, the would-be hospital bomber and the anti-public health, anti-Semitic protester, were members of National Socialist Movement, which is one of the neo-Nazi groups we're taking on in this suit. They met, were photographed together at a NSM induction membership event last year. Similarly, just yesterday, reports came out that Identity Europa, one of the other neo-Nazi defendants in our suit, was behind a now viral tweet from a supposed Antifa Twitter account that was urging violence and looting. As it turns out, Twitter was able to confirm that that was not in fact an Antifa account, but an account connected to Identity Europa, this white supremacist group. And over again, we've seen throughout these protests attempts by both white supremacist groups like our defendants and other extremists like the quote unquote Boogaloo extremists who seek to spur a civil war by targeting our institutions and our law and our government in some cases. We see these extremists trying to exploit this moment to spread their hate, spread their violence, and distract from the very real issues at hand, which are racial justice and police brutality. And so over and over again, we are reminded of the importance of the suit, of the centrality of these defendants to the movement, and how by taking them on in court, putting them on trial, when Mike and our team put them on the stand and hold them accountable for the violence they orchestrated, it will lay bare the hate and the bigotry that's at the core of their movement. And when we win these large civil judgments against them, we have the ability to bankrupt and dismantle them with very real impacts that go well beyond Charlottesville, and to send a clear message that will have national implications that if you are part of these violent conspiracies, there will be very real financial and legal consequences. I think there's so much more to say about this case and about this moment, and I'm sure Mike has a lot more to add as well. First, we'll pass it back to Haley to start diving into some of the questions we have, and please feel free to send anything that comes to mind.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy and Mike. We really appreciate it. And we admire and deeply respect the work that you're doing at times even putting yourselves at risk. And one of the questions that we received was, what kind of threats are the plaintiffs and the legal team facing in this case, which has obviously been very public and has gone on now for a few years?
Do you want to start or do you want me to, Mike?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Great question. So I guess the short answer is there's a fairly regular, I would say, barrage of at least chatter online about the case and the legal team and some of our plaintiffs. Most of the time, a lot of the chat is, I would say, pure hate speech. It's vile, it's offensive, it's anti-Semitic, it's racist, it's misogynistic. And I would say every once in a while, it crosses the line into threats. And so we do have a robust set of security, both physical and online, but we do become aware of threats periodically, and every once in a while we need to take legal action, either in the form of alerting law enforcement or following up in that respect. We have also filed motions with the court seeking to enjoin defendants from continuing to threaten us and our clients. So it has been, it's unlike a sort of run-of-the-mill civil case in the sense that there is an element of threats that bubbles up from time to time.
And to be completely honest, the biggest line item in IFA's budget is security because of the unique nature of this case. As Mike said, in most civil litigation, you're not dealing with neo-Nazis, and you're not dealing with neo-Nazis who try to flush their evidence down the toilet, but you're also not dealing with neo-Nazis who try to threaten your team, your lawyers, your plaintiffs. And so that is a huge factor for us and the work that we do to raise support for this case, to make sure that our legal team and our plaintiffs are safe right now. And of course, when we go to trial for weeks in Charlottesville this fall. And I think, even right now, it's funny, while we were on this call, I got another thread on Twitter from one of these white supremacists talking about how, the institutions are against you. Antifa is embedded everywhere, talking about how IFA must be Antifa because we're calling out neo-Nazis for trying to spur disinformation and violence right now. And so, as Mike said, this is fairly regular. At the same time, we are taking precautions and ensuring that our team are safe, and because of folks' generosity, we are also able to do so.
Well, we support you in these efforts. We have a few more questions specifically about the case, and then, as you can imagine, quite a few questions about the current situation. So I'm going to continue with the questions about the case, but again, continue to send us your questions. We will get to as many as possible. Paula has asked, who is representing and funding the defense? And similarly, William has asked, how competent and capable are the lawyers defending in your case, assuming they have counsel? And has it been possible to sanction defense counsel?
I'll take that, Amy. So they are, by and large, they're represented. There's a group of about 4 or 5 defense attorneys that represent some of the defendants. Some of them are pro se, meaning they represent themselves. They have no lawyer, which itself introduces an interesting element in litigating against them. But the others are represented by a group of 4 to 5 attorneys who represent, some of them represent individuals, single individuals, and some of them represent multiple defendants. Some of the lawyers are, I would say, true believers and have taken this case because they believe in the ideology of their clients. One in particular who represents multiple defendants says that he took the case on to, in his words, oppose the Jewish influence in America. There's another lawyer who actually bills himself as Nazi lawyer. And so some of the attorneys on the other side of the case are are down for the cause, so to speak. And so it's been interesting litigating against both the attorneys as well as the pro se defendants.
A few more questions about the case. Susan asks, how long do you think the case will take? Might it be resolved before November 3rd? You mentioned you're going to trial in October. And then similarly, there was a question about whether the lawsuit could be used to attack those communication platforms. You mentioned the digital platforms on which the neo-Nazis were communicating and in which this attack was planned.
So as to the first question, so the trial date is set October 26th. It is likely to be a lengthy trial, I would say in the order of 3 to 6 weeks. So I think there's very little chance, if any, that it wraps up before November 3rd. As to the communication platforms, this suit obviously is focused primarily on the defendants and not the platforms. In a lot of ways, the platforms in this case were exploited by the defendants far more than they were complicit. So I think there's a whole other, conversation we can have about how to kind of combat hate in other ways. But this particular suit focuses exclusively on the defendants that organized the rally.
And if I could just add a few other notes, I know that there is certainly great interest in how this case will dovetail with the broader national conversation happening this fall. And while IFA is explicitly nonpartisan and a 501c3, I do think you can't, look at this issue without understanding the broader national dynamics. And I do think having a case which is slated to at least open before the election, and in which we lay bare in our opening statements what exactly happened in Charlottesville, that it was no accident, and that these individuals and groups were there with the purpose of spreading violence, will be especially powerful. And we think at a time of national conversation, at a time when we're thinking about who we are as a country and our values, having that this fall will play a really critical role in the national debate, not just for folks who are thinking about that as it relates to November. And of course, that's not what this case is about, but it is a natural part of the conversation. But also as policymakers look towards, the new Congress and anything else that comes about, because this case will also highlight to the second issue that was raised, gaps that might exist in our policies, things that government, law enforcement, and the private sector can and must do better when it comes to the threat of white supremacist violence and terror. And so we think that this is happening at a critical time in that conversation, not just as it relates to November, but as it relates more broadly to our policy discussions and debate in this country. And I think also one of the things that I find particularly stunning over the last few weeks is, if you remember, probably just a week ago at this point, but it feels like 7 years, Trump went after Twitter for fact checking him on some of his recent comments and about mail-in voting, which again feels like 17 years ago that we were talking about that. And he brought up Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is the section of the law that currently protects most social media platforms from any real liability for what happens on their platform. And I just think it is worth all of us understanding that that as a country, we chose not to debate Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act when white supremacists co-opted and exploited social media to bring terror to Charlottesville and other places. But we are choosing to debate it now because Trump was fact-checked by Twitter. So when we think about our public conversation and how these things happen, that, at least from my perspective, is certainly infuriating and something that we can all keep in mind as we think about these policy issues, I hope.
And in your discovery that you've done and looking at the communication between the defendants, do you see a lot of references to the president?
Do you want to take that, Mike, to start, or do you want me?
Sure. Yes. We do. Obviously, the case is not about that. And so we're really focused on what they did in Charlottesville and the violence that they planned and they committed. But I think there's no doubt, and it certainly emerges from their communications, that they felt emboldened, to say the least, by the election of President Trump, by his comments after Charlottesville were roundly applauded, at least the very fine people on both sides, before he sort of walked it back. So certainly his messages and his policies are discussed, generally applauded, and are prominent in the communications that we review.
So we have quite a few questions that now speak to our current situation. And both Linda and Ariana have asked about something that you referenced, Amy, and that is one of the defendants that has recently emerged in the news posing as Antifa on social media and essentially instigating violence against peaceful protesters. Could you speak to this a bit further, and also your understanding of Antifa in general, because there's a lot of talk about it, but I don't know that there's a great understanding of the role they are playing versus the role of white nationalists and what we're seeing out in our streets right now.
Yeah, I think you're right that there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation happening right now as it relates to these protests and attempts to ultimately, as I think I mentioned earlier, so many of these are just efforts to distract from the actual issues at hand of racial justice. And so from our perspective, we want to be calling out the extremists who are trying to co-opt this moment to spread their hate and their violence, but we also want to be clear that just because there are those who are trying to co-opt this moment doesn't make the protests themselves and the very real anger and fear that people are feeling any less legitimate. And so it's really important for us to make that distinction. I'll say a few things, and I'm sure Mike has additional thoughts as well. Identity Europa is a group that is formed around this idea of a white identity, and it is, as I mentioned earlier, a key defendant in the suit. Mike can certainly speak to additional details, but they were the group that really organized white supremacists from around the country to come into Charlottesville for this weekend of violence. They also coined the phrase, I believe, "You will not replace us," that you've heard chanted in many of these sort of now very evocative moments, including that Friday night Tiki march. And NBC News reported last night that Twitter had discovered that this account that pretended to be an Antifa group was actually connected to Identity Europa and was encouraging violence and looting. And that tweet went around on a number of platforms, including Facebook and Nextdoor and other platforms where people were rightfully scared that this violence and looting was coming to their communities. And I believe it was even used by people either in the White House or affiliated with the president to make the point that Antifa was the major problem here. And of course, it came out that this was a tweet by a neo-Nazi group meant to both spread the disinformation that Antifa was behind this and also, of course, urge this violence and looting. And so that is certainly part of a much larger history of both disinformation and violence encouraged and in some cases committed by Identity Europa and many of these other white supremacist groups. It's also indicative of the ways in which these extremists, and I think it's important to understand that there's sort of a diversity of extremism happening now as it relates to the protests, but it's indicative of how these extremists are trying to take advantage of this moment to sow violence and hate and fear, and again, distract from the issues at hand. So we talked about the disinformation like what Identity Europa did. We also know that there are armed extremists showing up at these protests who are trying to start either what they call a boogaloo, which is essentially their code for a second civil war, or a race war. And some will even go so far as to claim that they're there to protect the protesters' right to be there. But I think we shouldn't let that fool us. These extremists are who sort of believe in this idea of a boogaloo, of a civil war, are really more of a loose coalition of militia members who believe that through violent anti-government resistance and other forms of violence, there will be some sort of upheaval that will reshape society through this sort of civil war. they're deeply committed to their guns, as you could imagine by the automatic weapons they carry. You might also be able to identify them with their Hawaiian shirts and other Hawaiian patterned gear, which is part of this broader Boogaloo meme that has developed. And certainly many of them, not necessarily all of them, but many of them are also white supremacists. And they dovetail with other forms of extremism, including accelerationists who similarly believe we should sort of be spurring the collapse of our society and bringing about a white ethno-state by targeting our institutions like the power grid and our hospitals. And you, again, might remember we had a white supremacist try to bomb a hospital in Missouri a couple months ago. Similarly, we've heard of law enforcement and others arresting people who've shown up to these protests. In one case, a man started firing into a Black Lives Matter protest. This was in North Carolina yesterday, and he appears to be part of the Boogaloo movement and was on some of the social media platforms, it seems. There was a man from Illinois who tried to bring bombs to Minneapolis, encouraging protesters to throw them at the police. So it's sort of gone both ways. You have them encouraging violence both against the protesters and trying to make it seem like the protesters themselves are violent. And then a few other things I would note: the Department of Homeland Security warned law enforcement actually that these white supremacists and other extremists were encouraging the shooting of protesters, and there were Telegram messages. Telegram is a platform of choice for a number of our defendants and other white supremacists, encouraging shooters to, quote, frame the crowd around you for violence, again, seeking to blame the protesters. And then, of course, we also know that these neo-Nazis and white supremacists have been using social media to highlight and to encourage others to action right now. And one of the things that I found particularly disturbing was an idea that I believe Vice reported on this, and it's been floating around these white supremacist sites, the idea that because law enforcement, fire departments, paramedics are spread so thin right now, some of these neo-Nazis have been talking about terror attacks on synagogues and infrastructure because we know that law enforcement and emergency services won't be able to respond as effectively as they might otherwise do. And so there really is this awful diversity of extremism that we're seeing at play here. Some trying to frame the protesters as violent or spread disinformation in that way, others targeting the protesters, and then others seeking to target infrastructure, Jewish communities, and others, while some of our law enforcement and emergency services are spread thin. And that, all of it is awful, but I think it speaks to the ways in which these groups and these individuals operate, and the role, of course, of social media in allowing them to connect and incite violence and in many cases turn those words into action.
If I could just add one thing specifically about the Antifa threat. One of the hallmarks of white supremacy, in addition to racism and anti-Semitism and violence, is duplicity. And kind of writ large, they have this idea that they are, in a kind of broad sense, victims. They are victims of what they call white genocide. And so they promote this idea, both on a kind of micro and a macro level, that they are acting in self-defense. They believe they are acting in self-defense generally, even if they're committing affirmative acts of violence, because in a larger sense, they are, they're protecting themselves against this white genocide that they claim is going on. But they also are incredibly manipulative in trying to basically design optics that suit their needs and that provide them kind of defenses in the event that they need it. So the idea that they would fake an Antifa site and put out fake messages under the guise of Antifa is kind of straight out of their playbook. We see similar behavior took place in the lead up to Unite the Right. It's nothing new for white supremacists to not just kind of stoke fear, but also plant seeds of evidence that they can ultimately use to further this this conspiracy theory that they are victims, and frankly, that Antifa is really the worst group that that we need to worry about.
Great. Well,
We only talk about the uplifting topics.
yes,
Here.
yes. Well, we do have one question. I wouldn't necessarily consider it uplifting, but Marilyn is looking for more information. So if you could quickly address Marilyn's question, can you suggest some books or newspapers we could read to learn more about these groups? And I know you guys also have a website, if you wanted to mention that as well. And then we do have a few more questions that we'll get to as well.
You are right. Our website actually, I think, has a treasure trove of information, including the complaint itself. Mike and our legal team have been doing a phenomenal job in the actual filings in the case, ensuring that they really are the best record of what actually happened in Charlottesville and how these groups operated there. And the complaint itself, which is on our website, truly is the only place where you could read the story of what happened in Charlottesville and the violence that unfolded and was planned, sort of cover to cover, if you will. And it's a read that even if you're not a lawyer, I think is something, I don't want to say easy because it's not a pleasant topic, but it's one that I think everyone can easily understand and grapple with. Similarly, there are a ton of journalists who are doing great work on this right now. I would encourage you to follow IFA on Twitter and on social media in general. We try to share these stories. There are reporters at Vice News who have been doing a really great job documenting some of these attempts by extremists to co-opt the protests, including Tess Owen and Ben McCouche and others. There are similarly, reporters who are generally on the extremism and disinformation beat inevitably cover our defendants and their supporters quite often. And, there's an NBC News story by, I believe it's Ben Collins and others on the Identity Europa news that Mike and I discussed. All of these also are, again, linked on our social media. And so I would encourage you to follow those for regular updates, not just on the case, but on the broader wave of extremism. And then in terms of books, and I don't know, there's so much to say here. One book that I think has certainly been very specific to the groups and the issues we're tackling on is a book called Everything You Love Will Burn by Vegas Tenold, who embedded actually with white nationalist groups, including, I believe, during Charlottesville, and then went on to become a researcher at the ADL. That book is phenomenal. There's a whole bunch of others that are relevant here. I'm looking at my books, including I have Andrew Morantz's Antisocial there, which looks at the role of social media in the spread of extremism. Mike, I'm sure you have recommendations as well.
Those are literally most of the ones that I was going to say. The only thing I would add to that, this isn't a book, but it's a documentary, is I would look at the Vice documentary that was done shortly after Charlottesville that I think very vividly recounts what happened.
Yeah, and it's short. It's only like half an hour or so, so you can get a good sense for our defendants without spending your whole evening consumed in neo-Nazis.
And our final set of questions, and I've been grouping them at this point, have to do with what we are now witnessing when we look on Twitter, when we watch the news, and it's the events of the past 24 hours. And of course, we do not all have the legal perspective you do. So as we are watching this, we have two questions. One from Richard Linter. If you could talk to us about the legal implications of armed officers using force and tear gas and rubber bullets to forcibly move peaceful protesters who have broken no laws. That's the first question. And the second one from Marvin asks about the legality of the president's use of the military under the 1907 Insurrection law that we saw him attempt to invoke, though I think somewhat illegally, yesterday. So we'll end on those two those two notes, but unfortunately I think that we may see more of this, so I think people want to hear from you all about how we can view this in the perspective of the law.
I will say generally, as a general matter, what we have seen in terms of the police response to protesters across the country has been inappropriate and excessive. There certainly are exceptions. There certainly are officers and departments that have not acted inappropriately, but the run-of-the-mill videos that we're seeing about not just I think there's some that are obvious unprovoked use of force that are unquestionably excessive, but you also can't generally speaking use tear gas kind of affirmatively as opposed to reactively, and so I think we have seen not just force as we commonly understand it used excessively and inappropriately, but I think the use of tear gas has been excessive and unwarranted, and I think there may well be and ought to be a legal response to it. I'm forgetting what the second question was. Oh, our president.
Well, the 1907 law that he apparently attempted to invoke yesterday, but you know, I think with the exception of the District of Columbia, can't actually force states to use the military against domestically.
Yeah, I mean, I'm no expert on that, but that is my understanding, is that you cannot use the military in the manner in which President Trump is advocating. So I believe, like much of what he does goes well beyond his presidential authority.
If I can jump in for a second, not to pretend like I know anything more than Mike does on this, because he's, particularly as it relates to police, I feel like Mike is the expert given his background. I will say this can easily be a depressing conversation, in that talking about neo-Nazis and extremists and people who want to spur a civil war and tear gassing protesters and the president's abuse of power, this can all be quite depressing. And for me, at least, there is something heartening in the fact that there's something very tangible you could do right now, which is this lawsuit. It is one of the few concrete, tangible steps people can get involved with and take to fight back against rising extremism, white supremacy, anti-Semitism, racism. And it's made all the more urgent by what we've seen over the last few days, not just as it relates to the plague of white supremacy in our country, but also the ways in which these extremists are trying to exploit the moment, including, again, some of our defendants. And so I always like to remind people that, as depressing as some of these conversations might be on their face, my hope is that we can end on an optimistic note and know that there is something tangible and concrete you can do by getting involved, going to integrityfirstforamerica.org and signing up for case updates. If you'd like to donate, it goes directly to supporting the suit. There's an activist toolkit with sample social media content, and we are eager for folks to get out the word that this is happening. And there's a ton of other information and resources there, including the lawsuit itself, that you could read and share in order to spread the word. So at a time when it is very easy to feel frustrated and scared and angry, we hope that this does provide a concrete, tangible thing that you can do to begin to fight back against white supremacy and against anti-Semitism and racism.
Thank you so much, Amy. It's good to end on a positive note, and certainly the commitment of you and Michael, of your colleagues, Robbie Kaplan, and Karen Dunn and others is truly admirable, and we stand with you. And also, we encourage folks to visit our website as well, jewishdems.org, to join JDCA in our efforts to organize across the country to create change. You can sign up for a state chapter on your website, and we also are continuing this conversation. We will hear from the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, on Thursday at 12:30 Eastern. We're very excited. We've had 12 calls now with Democrats leading in crisis, and it will be great to hear from the leader, the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, on Thursday at 12:30. So please sign up on our website. And thank you so much to Integrity First for America for showing us this commitment to combating hatred in all of its forms. We are appreciative for your time and sharing this information with us today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thanks.